I never imagined my own mother would betray me at the worst possible time, but that's exactly what happened. My parents got divorced when I was 9, and I lived mostly with my dad for years. My relationship with my mother was cordial at best, but we never really had a close bond. It wasn't that she was cruel from the start. She just always seemed more concerned with herself than anything else. When I turned 17, she remarried a man who already had 2 children a few years younger than me. I didn't think too much of it at the time. I was looking forward to starting college soon, and I figured her new life wouldn't affect me too directly. Then my dad got sick. It happened fast. One day, he was driving me around town to shop for dorm room essentials, and the next month, he was lying in a hospital bed, hooked up to all sorts of machines. I couldn't process it. We were told he had a rare form of cancer, and despite every attempt by the doctors, nothing seemed to work. I was with him almost every day, skipping classes and putting my life on hold so I could be by his side. Watching him wither away was the hardest thing I'd ever done. His final wish was that I make peace with my mother, but I never promised I'd do that. I was there when he passed, holding his hand. I still remember the exact moment his eyes drifted shut and how my entire world tilted. After the funeral, I got a call from my mother's new husband. He told me they were redecorating the house I'd grown up in. I wasn't entirely sure why they felt they had the right to do that, but I figured maybe Mom wanted to change things around to start fresh. I wasn't living there anymore, so I didn't see the harm in letting them repaint or rearrange furniture. But I told him specifically that my room needed to stay untouched, at least until I had a chance to move my personal belongings. I'd inherited a few sentimental items from Dad, but most of my old clothes, books, and photos were still at Mom's house. He gave me a non-committal grunt in response, which didn't exactly reassure me. I was still numb from losing my dad, so I didn't push it. The next day, I went back to campus to finalize some paperwork. I was drained emotionally, and the last thing I wanted was a confrontation with my mother. Part of me secretly hoped that maybe this time she would behave decently. Maybe my dad's passing would soften her heart. But deep down, I knew that was wishful thinking. She'd always been more interested in appearances and pleasing whoever she was with at the time. The following week, I found out just how wrong I was to trust her at all. I got a frantic phone call from a friend who lived across the street from my mother. She said she'd seen strangers hauling boxes out of the house and loading them into a van. My friend recognized some of the boxes. They had my name scribbled on them. When she asked what was happening, she was told that these items were being sold to make space for the new kids. My friend was so confused because she knew I hadn't asked anyone to sell my things. She tried to call me immediately, but I missed her call at first. When I finally listened to her voicemail, my heart dropped. She said she was sorry if she was overstepping, but she thought I should know that all my possessions were being carted away by a bunch of people she'd never seen before. I jumped in my car and drove straight to my mother's house, ignoring every speed limit sign on the way. The betrayal felt like a gut punch, especially coming so soon after my dad's funeral. By the time I got there, the van was gone. My mother greeted me at the door with the same artificially sweet smile I'd come to despise. She didn't even try to hide what she had done. She told me it was for the best, that I didn't really need all that junk, and it was time to let go of the past. I was too shocked to speak at first. I demanded she tell me where she'd taken my belongings, but she shrugged and said she'd sold them all. She claimed she needed the money to redecorate the house so her stepkids could have rooms that fit their tastes. I couldn't believe it. This was everything I had left from my childhood: yearbooks, gifts, sentimental trinkets, and a few valuable collectibles my dad had given me over the years. She sold them without even asking, all to cater to her new husband's kids who hardly even knew me. I felt something inside me snap. I told her that she had no right to sell anything that belonged to me, especially not after Dad's funeral. She acted like I was being dramatic, saying I should be focusing on my future instead of clinging to old stuff. Her husband appeared behind her, nodding in agreement. The two of them stood there like a united front of smug entitlement. The stepkids hovered in the background, looking bored. They didn't even seem interested in the drama. I wanted to scream. Instead, I told my mother I was done. Then I stormed out. I sat in my car, shaking with anger, mourning the items I'd never get back. It felt like a final severing of whatever little bond we had left. I didn't want to see her face again. Little did I know that soon she would regret every single decision she'd made that day. A few days later, I was contacted by Dad's lawyer. I was sure it was something related to funeral expenses or small details about his estate. The lawyer was a kind older man who invited me to his office. I walked in, still feeling the weight of my grief. He sat me down and told me my father had left a will. My eyes filled with tears because I didn't even know he'd had the time or foresight to do that. But Dad was always meticulous. It didn't surprise me that he had planned for every eventuality, even his own passing. The lawyer explained that my dad left me the house, the same house my mother was living in with her new family. I nearly fell off my chair. As far as I knew, the house was in both my parents' names. But apparently, when they got divorced, Dad negotiated to buy out her share to ensure I'd have a stable place to grow up in. The agreement let her stay there as long as she wanted. But upon Dad's death, ownership transferred fully to me. The will was crystal clear about it. I was stunned. The lawyer handed me the documents and my name was right there, listed as the sole beneficiary. I asked him if my mother knew, and he said she had been informed but didn't believe it at first. He also added that if she refused to vacate, I might have to take legal action. My anger from the betrayal at my dad's funeral flared up again, but this time it was mixed with a sense of grim satisfaction. I had leverage now. I went home and thought about my next move. My mother had effectively stolen from me by selling my belongings. She didn't give me a cent from that sale, and she hadn't even apologized. She made it clear she didn't care about my feelings, only about pleasing her new husband and stepchildren. My father must have known, on some level, that she was toxic. That's probably why he arranged for me to inherit the house outright. I didn't want to stoop to her level, but I also couldn't just let her walk all over me again. I decided to pay her a visit the next day, documents in hand. When she saw me, she rolled her eyes, as if my presence was a burden. Her new husband lurked around the corner, probably expecting me to start another shouting match. But I didn't shout. I calmly took out the papers and laid out the terms. The house was mine now. If they wanted to live there, they'd have to pay me rent at a fair market rate. If they couldn't afford it or refused, they'd have to leave. I also mentioned I knew she had sold my belongings and I'd be considering legal action if she didn't comply with my terms. She stared at me in disbelief, her mouth flapping open like a fish out of water. Her husband turned beet red and insisted I had no right to disrupt their home. But I did have that right. Legally, it was now my property. For a moment, I felt a pang of guilt. It was the house I'd grown up in, and I'd always imagined it as my safe haven. Evicting my own mother felt surreal, almost heartless. But then I remembered how she'd sold my memories. I thought about my father, whose dying wish was for me to have security. This wasn't about petty revenge. It was about standing up for myself and respecting Dad's final gift to me. They screamed and yelled, threatened to call the cops. I told them to go ahead because I'd be happy to show the cops the legal documents proving my ownership. My mother then tried a different tactic. She burst into tears, pleading with me to reconsider, saying they'd be on the street and that her stepchildren would suffer. She begged me to be reasonable, but I refused to back down. She had a job, her husband had a job, and they could certainly find a smaller place if they couldn't afford my rent. I wasn't about to subsidize the people who had stolen my possessions and disrespected me in my time of grief. She started ranting about how Dad never cared about her and how she deserved the house for putting up with him all those years. That was the last straw. I told her she had 1 month to decide, pay rent or move out. Then I left, ignoring her wailing as I walked out the door. I spent the next few weeks focusing on college and trying to piece my life back together. Every so often, I'd get a barrage of texts and phone calls from my mother or her husband. Sometimes they'd threaten me. Other times they'd try to guilt trip me by saying the stepkids were having a hard time at school. I didn't respond. I had made my terms clear. Meanwhile, I looked into whether I'd have any legal recourse to recover damages for the items they sold. It turned out I'd have a strong case, but it might get complicated since I'd need to prove their value. Still, the possibility was there. My mother missed the first rent payment deadline. I sent a formal notice, reminding her of our agreement. She responded with an angry voicemail about how I was an ungrateful child. She played the victim, pretending she hadn't done anything wrong. I saved the voicemail, just in case it could be useful later. My lawyer said these messages might help paint a picture of her hostility if we ended up in a court battle. About a month after I'd laid down the law, I got a text from my mother. She said they would pay the rent but needed more time. She asked if I'd be willing to lower the amount. I refused because I'd based my figure on local rental rates, which was already generous. In truth, I'd have been happier if she moved out and gave me a chance to reclaim my childhood home. In the meantime, I found out through my friend across the street that my mother had tried to rent out one of the spare rooms to make extra money. She'd apparently posted an ad online stating that it was her property. When I heard that, I was livid. She had no right to sublet any part of the house without my permission. I immediately contacted my lawyer, who recommended I send a cease and desist letter or consider beginning the eviction process. I had tried to be reasonable, but her latest stunt showed me she had no intention of respecting my ownership. I called her up and asked her what the hell she was thinking. She played dumb at first, acting like she didn't know it was a problem. Then she said she was desperate and couldn't afford the rent unless she rented out the room. I asked why she thought it was okay to profit off my property without consulting me. She had no answer. I told her that if she tried it again, I'd serve her eviction papers immediately. She screamed into the phone, accusing me of heartlessness and greed. I hung up, shaken but resolved. She was leaving me no choice. I had a long talk with my lawyer. He advised me to move quickly if I wanted to avoid further complications. The last thing I needed was a random stranger moving in, complicating the process. So, I filed for eviction, naming my mother and her husband. As painful as it was, it felt necessary. Once my mother received the eviction notice, all hell broke loose. She bombarded me with messages, some begging for mercy, others threatening to destroy my reputation. She claimed she would tell everyone I was an abusive child who had tormented her for years. It was laughable, given that I'd lived with Dad most of my life. Still, the emotional toll was heavy. Part of me wondered if I was doing the right thing, but every time I doubted myself, I'd remember all the times she put her own needs before mine, how she sold my keepsakes, and how she never once apologized. The day she was served, I got a call from my step-siblings. They were furious, blaming me for uprooting their lives. I told them to take it up with their parents. I wasn't about to coddle them. They were old enough to understand that actions have consequences. Their father tried to confront me in person at my college campus, which was intimidating, but I reported him to campus security. I didn't want any part of his drama. Finally, the court date arrived. My mother made a last-minute attempt to delay, claiming health issues, but the judge saw through it. My lawyer presented the deed and the will, demonstrating clear ownership in my name. He also showed the texts and voicemails where my mother admitted she was selling my belongings and refused to pay rent. The judge had little patience for her sob story. He ruled in my favor, giving her 2 weeks to vacate. When we walked out of the courtroom, my mother tried one last emotional appeal. She said she'd be homeless, that her husband had lost his job and couldn't support them. She begged me to give them more time or at least let the stepkids stay. I stared at her, remembering how she'd looked at me with cold indifference when she sold my cherished possessions. Her tears didn't move me. I'd given her more chances than she ever deserved. I told her, in no uncertain terms, that this was her consequence for betraying me. I mentioned how Dad had worked so hard to protect me because he knew exactly who she was. Then I turned around and left. Eviction day came faster than I'd expected. I went to the house with my lawyer and a couple of friends for support. My mother and her family were scrambling to load their stuff into a moving truck. There was no sign of the fancy new furniture she'd bought with the money from selling my belongings. Apparently, they'd had to pawn a lot of stuff just to stay afloat. She glared at me as if I were the devil incarnate. Her husband made some snide remark about how I'd burn in hell for doing this to them. I didn't bother responding. My lawyer reminded them they had to leave peacefully or risk being escorted out by law enforcement. They piled into their cars and drove off without so much as a goodbye. For a moment, I felt a strange heaviness settle over me. I was finally standing in my own house, the one Dad had left me. The rooms were largely empty, stripped down to the bare walls. Everything I'd left there as a child was gone, sold, or discarded. But as I wandered from room to room, I realized it was also a chance for a new start. My mother's presence was no longer lurking in the corners, filling the air with resentment. It was mine, for better or worse, and I felt a rush of gratitude toward my dad. Even in death, he had looked out for me. I thought about the financial hit I'd taken with my belongings gone. Some had been priceless in sentimental value, others worth actual money. I spoke to the lawyer about a possible lawsuit against my mother, but he advised that it might be more trouble than it was worth, especially if she and her husband were already broke. Still, I wasn't in the mood to offer any mercy. They had found money to buy furniture and do renovations, so maybe they had resources I didn't know about. I ended up filing a police report for theft. The officer I spoke with was sympathetic, but he warned me it could be a long process. I wasn't doing it for the money. I wanted a legal record of what she'd done. If she tried to come back into my life, I wanted proof of her betrayal. Maybe the investigation would deter her from pulling any more stunts. I allowed myself a moment of satisfaction in knowing she had to scramble to find a place to live. She would no longer benefit from my father's generosity. In the weeks that followed, I got sporadic text messages from random numbers, presumably her or her husband, hurling insults and curses at me. I blocked each one as soon as I realized who it was. I knew they were angry, but they had done this to themselves. After the house was cleared out, I began renovating it in my own style. I set up a small memorial corner for my dad with a framed photo and a few items that reminded me of him. I knew he'd have been proud to see me taking control of my life. I moved in full-time, grateful for the haven he left me. My mother never showed up at the doorstep again. Maybe she was too ashamed, or maybe she just knew she wouldn't be welcome. People have asked me if I regret being so harsh. The truth is, no. She betrayed me when I was at my lowest. She chose her new family over me in the most callous way. My dad's final gift was not just the house, but also the chance to break free from her control. She sold my possessions, but she couldn't sell my future, and I'm not about to forgive her for that. Goodbye.